Hello, my name is John Finn, and I'm a researcher on multi-species mixtures with Teagasc, based at Johnstown Castle in the southeast of Ireland. Along with my collaborator, Shona Baker, I'm delighted to be able to join you, even if virtually, for this session with Grounds for Growth. During this talk, I'm going to be talking about multi-species mixtures and our research over the last 20 years or so, which has looked at the design of multi-species mixtures and a lot of research on the yields that we get from them, some of the other ecosystem services that benefit soil biodiversity, for example, and then a quick look at some recent research which is coming out on the effects of multi-species mixtures with less nitrogen inputs on dairy performance. So just want to quickly acknowledge some of our funders in this slide, especially the Department of Agriculture in Ireland, in the south of Ireland, and DAERA in Northern Ireland, who are jointly funding the Multi for More project, which you can find more about online. So this morning, what I'd like to talk about is multi-species grassland mixtures, especially in relation to nitrogen inputs and the resulting forage yields. I want to look at some specific ecosystem goods and services, a quick look at drought and resilience, and also livestock performance, all within 20 minutes. Importantly, we are experiencing huge pressure to reduce fertilizer use due to the enormous energy consumption and the environmental consequence involved in the production of fertilizer, nitrogen fertilizer that is, as well as the greenhouse gas emissions and nitrate leaching that results from the application of fertilizer, and also the very high financial pressure experienced from nitrogen fertilizer use, especially in recent years, and the volatility in prices that has been seen. So very quickly, what are multi-species forests? Because we can see a variety of grassland types, some of which are multi-species and some of which are not. So very traditionally in many temperate parts of the world with high yielding grasslands, there has been a tendency to use perennial ryegrass monocultures that have quite high levels of nitrogen input. There's been a lot of research in recent years on two species combination of ryegrass and white clover to, again, reduce the nitrogen input, and the symbiotic nitrogen fixation from clover is helping to compensate that. There's also been a lot of work, and including some of our own, on perennial ryegrass with white clover, but also the addition of other species, whether it's other grass species, clover, and especially herbs, which is quite novel in recent years, at least from an experimental investigation. And this is the kind of work with a limited set of grasses, legumes, and herbs that has dominated my own research over the last few years. There's also multi-species mixtures which are much more species rich and can be anything from 15 to 40 species. We tend not to look at those. I can talk about that in the questions if anybody wishes, but they can tend to be much more hit and miss, and a lot of those species disappear within 1 or 2 years. So one of the ways in which our research has differed has been the experimental designs and the approaches that we take for testing what are the benefits of mixtures, and also can we identify the best performing mixture. Very often an experiment or an agronomist will take an experiment like this and take 3 species, as you can see here, with yields, for example, for the species in red, green, and yellow, grow them as monocultures in a trial and compare them. Our approach to multi-species mixtures departs from this approach, and what we would expect when we take 1/3 of each of these species at sowing is that we get 1/3 of their yields, which is exactly what's been shown in this bar. So our expected mixture performance would be a proportion, or the relevant proportion, of their performance in monoculture. And then a lot of our research is about investigating, well, if we implement these relative proportions of the species in an experiment, how much of a difference in mixture yield do we see from what was expected? And in this example, we are sticking with 1/3 of each of the monocultures, But we also do a lot of work which varies from 1/3. So we could have 50-50 of each. We could have 75-25 of two species. We could do a 3-species mixture, which is 60-20-20. And a real benefit of that is that we can then identify specific combinations. So starting with our grass monoculture here, herb monoculture, and a legume monoculture. And this ternary diagram is a way of visualizing how we can get different relative proportions and visualize the relative proportions and their effect on something like yield, represented by this scale here. So we can see here we've got the monocultures of each of 3 species or groups. We've got this point here would indicate the 50-50 combination of grass herb. This point here would indicate the 1/3 of each of the contributions of grass legume herb. And the colored contour indicates what is the yield associated with that point. And again, a real strength of this design is that in addition to looking at richness and composition, as in if it's a grass or if it's a herb, we can also look at relative abundance. And we can predict, using this approach, for example, a mixture that you would never sow probably in an actual field experiment, but we can still predict its yield, for example, for the 70-10-20 combination here, or any of the proportions within this design space. I'm not going to talk too much more about that because there's a lot published on it, and anybody who's interested can pursue it in these references here. And having done a lot of these kinds of experiments, well, what do we learn from them? And I would say if you get nothing else from today's talk, these are some of the principles for mixture design that we've picked up over the years. So these include, for example, one should use the highest yielding of whatever grasses you're interested in, clovers and herbs. This very often also relates to using species for which there is good seed quality and a good cultivar choice for that type. Of course, the forage has to be digestible. And a real strength of this approach is that we're selecting species which have complementarity in their resource utilization. So, for example, they're better at using the available light together. They're better using the available soil resources and nutrients. Of course, that legume contribution is extremely important in contributing extra nitrogen from symbiotic nitrogen fixation. Some of the other lessons that we've learned is that the functional traits that differ most are between the plant functional groups of grasses, legumes, and herbs, and 2 or 3 functional groups with 3 to 8 species you tend not to get any additional benefit of going above this, certainly for yield. We see robust effects so that within quite large ranges of the species proportions, we see quite high yields. And it's important to have species that can persist over time and maintain their contributions. So, for example, if you have the best benefit coming from 1/3 of each of 3 functional groups, it's important to be able to maintain that approximately 1/3 of each over time. And again, we can talk more about that later. So looking at some of the experiments that we've done on this and looking at some of the key outcomes, we see that within the same level of nitrogen fertilizer, multi-species mixtures and plot experiments, they typically out-yield the average of the component monocultures. So they perform better than the expected average of the monocultures that are contributing to them. They often out-yield the highest yielding monoculture, so we see transgressive over-yielding, and they typically have lower weed biomass. So that's when we're comparing monocultures and mixtures within the same level of nitrogen fertilizer. And of course, a much more important question in recent years is, what about different nitrogen levels? Can mixtures with lower nitrogen match or exceed the performance of the monocultures, for example, perennial ryegrass with higher nitrogen? So some of the research that we've been doing on this has been, and we've had several studies, but a particularly nice one was done by Guylaine Grange, whose work has recently been published. And here, for example, it's a 6-species experiment with 2 grasses, ryegrass, timothy, red clover, white clover, chicory, and plantain. And he's grown them over 2 years, and these have been at 150 kgs of nitrogen per year. The predicted or the average monoculture performance of these 6 species is here. So the equiproportional mixture we would predict would be this yield here. We also included a perennial ryegrass with 300 kilos of nitrogen, so twice the nitrogen input as a high reference comparison. And over all of this, we see that the multi-species mixture, the actual performance in the field, was this level here, just under 12 tons, averaged over 2 years, which included a drought year. So we can clearly see that the multi-species mixture performed better than all of the monocultures, and it also performed better than the high nitrogen perennial ryegrass. And there's been quite a few experiments like this. Just to give you one more example, here's some work done by Thomas Maloney, where he's implemented a nitrogen fertilizer gradient going from 0 to 360 kilos of nitrogen. Again, in our system, this would be illegal at this point, but as an experimental trial, it's very useful to see and get to that point where nitrogen is essentially not limiting the growth of grass anymore. So he's done this for perennial ryegrass, and again, found this quite expected curve where there's a very strong nitrogen response that flattens as you get to the higher levels. And in comparison, he's looked at different types of mixtures. So this one is a more simple mixture where there's 2 grasses and 2 clovers. And again, you get less of a strong response to nitrogen. And then this final example here is a 6 species example with 2 grasses, 2 clovers, and 2 herbs in a silage system, I should say. And there's a very weak response to nitrogen here. And what he's finding is that the annual yield achieved by perennial ryegrass with 360 kilos of nitrogen is matched by the multi-species mixtures, sometimes with only 120 kilos of nitrogen. So there is a huge potential for nitrogen saving with multi-species mixtures, and of course, largely arising from the use of the clover in them, and that clover contributing symbiotic end fixation. Some of our work has also looked at what is the role of multi-species mixtures in providing insurance or resilience to drought. When we first started doing these experiments, I remember some colleagues would actually be laughing about the idea that we would need to look or be interested in looking at drought results in Ireland. But after there was a severe drought here in 2018, and nobody was laughing at this point, when parts of Ireland were absolutely scorched. And we can see here in Gillan's experiment where he's implemented a drought, we've had to actually irrigate the supposed non-drought comparison just to maintain the experimental contrast. Similar experiments, what we've tended to do is, again, contrast different types of species. So we've got shallow rooting and deep rooting herbs and grasses, and a deep rooting red clover and a shallow rooting white clover. So we're trying to choose species that we would expect to best exploit the moisture in the lower levels of soil. We've harvested over 2 years. This is an example of one of those years where we harvest all of the plots, mixtures, and monocultures. We implement a drought at this point. We harvest halfway through the drought. We harvest at the end of the drought, and then we harvest in the recovery period after drought. And you can see quite a significant effect of the experimental drought at this point. What we want to compare is the mean yield and the variation in yield in this mid-drought, end drought, and recovery period, which I'll move on to next. So what we see in the 2 sites in Ireland and in Switzerland, we compare monocultures, 2 species mixtures, and 4 species mixtures of the species that I mentioned, grass, herb, red clover, white clover, and compare their mean yield over these 3 harvests. So it's the mean yield over the harvests, which is why this scale is so low. And what we see in both sites is that the mean yield increases as species richness increases, and the variation in yield decreases. So there's less variation in the 4 species richness at both sides than there is in the monocultures. So this is classic yield stability. As richness increases, the yield increases and the variation decreases. And our key question was, does this also hold under the drought conditions? And the answer is yes, in that we see a suppressive effect on yield of drought, as you'd expect, but under the drought conditions, we also see that mean yield increases, especially in the Swiss site, and the variation in yield decreases. And indeed, even at these sites, we see that the performance of the mixtures under drought, okay, so mixtures under drought equal the monocultures under rain-fed normal conditions, or exceeded in this case. So this shows the strong adaptation potential that there can be in mixtures to cope with drought and add resistance to drought. In a related experiment, Gillan Grange again was looking at how diversity could mitigate the drought effects. And this is the same graph, it includes the same graph as before, which was the rain-fed comparison here. But now we also show the drought effects. So the yield, the total annual yield after a 9-week drought, as shown here. And again, what we see is that the mixtures are performing better than the monocultures under drought, but also that the mixture under drought can exceed the yields or equal the yields of the monocultures under rain-fed conditions. Again, showing this really strong adaptation potential of the mixtures in terms of total annual yield. Looking at some of the other ecosystem functions very quickly, from the same set of plots, we've used these static chambers to measure nitrous oxide emissions and emissions intensity from mixtures. And very quickly, we just see that when we compare the emissions intensity, so this is the nitrous oxide, a very potent greenhouse gas, from a lowland perennial monoculture with 300 kilos of nitrogen, the same perennial ryegrass monoculture with 150 kilos of nitrogen, and the 6 species mixture with 150 kilos of nitrogen, the amount of nitrous oxide emissions per unit ton of yield of forage is lowest in the multi-species mixtures. I know that the Grounds for Growth Conference is very interested in soil conditions, soil health, and soil biodiversity. And one of the other things that we've been looking at most recently is how do mixtures affect soil biodiversity? And this is one of the first times that this has been done, where we're looking at the different functional groups of nematodes in the soil underneath the different types of plots. And there are lots of indices which strongly reflect the balance of these different types of functional groups that feed on bacteria in the soil, that feed on other nematodes, and feed on, other nematodes only as predatory nematodes, omnivorous nematodes that can feed on multiple things, and also plant parasites, which will be quite important for those of us interested in growing plants. And again, we can see that when we compare the grass, legume, and herb monocultures or grass-only combinations, we see that there's a distinct difference in them and the 6 species multi-species mixture. So we see many more of the omnivores, and especially these predators, which are quite specific and have a very large effect on indices of soil health. So this is one example of this index of soil health called the maturity index. And again, this is similar to the image I showed earlier, where this point here represents, in the ternary, represents the legume monoculture, the grass monoculture, and the herb monoculture. And these contours here show that there's a very strong effect of mixing the 3 functional groups of legume, grasses, and herbs on this maturity index. And this is one of the first times that we've been able to show that plant diversity in more intensively managed pastures has this very strong synergistic effect on this nematode-based index that reflects soil health. So moving on from plots, a lot of our work has been conducted on the agronomy and based on plots. And a real interesting question next is, when we move from plots to paddocks, what happens? Do we see the similar performances in yields? And does this translate into benefits for dairy systems? And I suppose overall the answer is yes. Here's a lovely example from 2016 from INRA in France, where they've got a paddock scale experiment comparing perennial ryegrass, ryegrass clovers, ryegrass with extra chicory, and ryegrass clovers, chicory, and festuca. So they've got a gradient of plant diversity here, and we're looking at yield and found that these 2 groups, so the herb-containing groups, gave higher milk production. Very interesting study. Here's another one, a meta-analysis by Kate McCarthy in UCD, showing that compared to ryegrass-only systems, clover and multi-species systems had higher intake. They delivered more milk, and in multi-species, they delivered more milk solids in terms of protein and lactose. So this is quite an interesting meta-analysis of other existing studies, some of which are short-term and some which are longer-term. again, showing benefits of clover containing as well as multi-species on milk performance. Here's another study from our farm here at Johnstown Castle, where we're comparing a lowly and perenne ryegrass-dominated high nitrogen system, 220 kilos, with a lower nitrogen, 96 kilo of N on multi-species. And again, there's almost identical milk performance through the year when we look at it as milk solids per cow per day. Finally, a really nice study here from Alain Jeskel's recent work from his PhD in Curtin's Farm in Moore Park with my colleague Brendan Horan. And again, similar idea that the multi-species in the yellow line here with much lower levels of nitrogen compared to the perennial ryegrass contrast. So perennial ryegrass is 250. There's a perennial ryegrass white clover with 125 kilos of N, and the multi-species with 125 kilos of N. And again, very little difference between them overall, despite these very large differences in nitrogen input. So we see slightly higher milk yield from the multi-species. Milk solids is higher from both the clover and the multi-species. And this also reflects a fairly equivalent forage quality between the perennial ryegrass, grass clover, and the multi-species. So in conclusion, after that whistle-stop tour of some of these key messages, I want to summarize them here again. So we would conclude that the use of legumes is a cost-effective strategy to displace the costs, both environmental and economic, of fertilizer nitrogen. These lower nitrogen legume-based mixtures can be as productive, if not more productive, than higher than grass-only systems with higher nitrogen. There are associated benefits to nitrogen use efficiency. We see increased drought resilience. We see increased yield stability with mixtures, and a contribution to improved soil health and reduced N2O emissions intensity. And this recent raft of research is coming through now and is emerging at the moment from livestock studies at field and paddock scale, and over a year or two at least, show that there is equal or higher performance from legume-based mixtures with lower nitrogen when they're compared to grass-only systems with higher nitrogen. So with that, I'd like to once again thank the Grounds for Growth organisers for the invitation to attend, and wish you all an excellent conference. Thank you.
Thank you and welcome. And firstly, I'd like to thank Cass Liskin for the invite, the chance to speak to you all. I've been privileged, I suppose, with the role that I've got, which is with Barrenbroke Australia, the old heritage seeds. I'm actually the research agronomist for temperate species, which actually encompasses most of the species that we've touched on or talked about during this conference. And I also, for peculiar reasons, relief milk for dairy farmers in West Gippsland. And what that's actually given me the opportunity to do is actually look at a considerable number of different pasture types and how well they perform. And in doing that, in speaking to these particular producers and dairy farmers, their why. And if it's one thing that's really became quite evident during the course of this conference is that we've all got our own why as to why we want to pursue multi-species swards. I will just say one thing is I think in some ways the reason we're here is that we've actually oversimplified our perennial ryegrass systems. You know, it wasn't that long ago. I'm also a student of Peter Sales, and I'd like to acknowledge Peter as well, that when Peter was teaching us pasture agronomy, the legume component in grass swards was sacrosanct. You know, it was 20, 30, 40%. We actually haven't done that anymore. We've oversimplified the system, increasing reliance on nitrogen. So it's no great surprise that our systems have come to a point where they're not performing like we expect them to do. So what I'm going to do today is speak a little bit about the why, and then hopefully Kath asked me to speak about the where, but I think with hindsight it's probably about the where, the what and the how. I'm not going to delve too deeply into those. We've got Elaine's going to speak to us about the importance of a particular herd feeding plantain. I'm going to let Jade speak to you about transitioning from annual species, creating that disturbance that we need to reset the system, and then moving on to a more perennial system that we'd all like to have. And then we're going to have Adam speak to us as well. And I'm really keen to hear Adam speak because he actually designs his systems from a couple of species up. He doesn't start out like this and come back to this. And I think that's really quite important. So these benefits here that I've highlighted, they're not mine. This comes from the review by Anna Thompson and Rodrigo Alvarez, CSIRO 2003. And it lists the whole range of different benefits, which John's highlighted as well. So reduce reliance on nitrogen fertiliser, shoulder season production if you actually diversify and challenge and increase the number of species you've got in each of those particular functional groups, contribute to healthy soils. And Lynn, thank you for yesterday. You gave me a moment of clarity with regards to texture and its importance to soil health. And while I think sometimes you need an annual system to kick-start the process because some of those heavier soil types need a disturbance. We need to have a disruptor to give us the chance to actually rebuild our systems to actually provide all those soil health benefits that we're after. Grazing animals. I'm not going to go over these too much because I think John's already encapsulated this really quite well. But if you do get a chance, have a look at that review by Anna and Rodrigo. But there are also challenges. It's not just a whole lot of benefits. We need to think about things too. And seed mixture design, which this particular session is all about, is really, really quite important. And I'm going to challenge, hopefully, your thinking on some of those, some of the later slides. The establishment of agronomy, really, really quite important. Monitoring and measurement. So you've got Kevin Smith in the audience and his group looking at different ways of measuring and monitoring things. And if you don't monitor, you don't measure, you can't manage. Okay? And that management portion is really, really quite important. And the shift in thinking and the knowledge you need to acquire to actually support your decision before you actually decide to head down this path now. We've got some really, I think, inspiring examples. We've got Kate here, we've got Adam who's going to tell us what he does, we've got Matt, Brad and Simon, I don't think I've forgotten, and Karen G. All really, really good examples of people who've gone out. You know, these are our early adopters that decided to make the change because something's inspired them to do it. You know, they're pursuing some of these whys. But the bigger challenge for Dairy Australia and agronomists like myself and the like is how do we actually take those successes, reinforce those successes, discuss our failures to encourage the greater bulk of dairy farmers to particularly adopt these practices and, you know, generate and capture some of these benefits. So with diversity comes complexity. I actually think this is a really neat slide, and I think it sort of highlights where we've potentially gone wrong. So on the right there, monoculture ryegrass system, again, oops. Now we've got a monoculture, so it's not just above the ground, it's what's going on below the ground. It's the same carbon source, it's the same type of root matter, it's the same organic matter going back into the system, so it actually sort of restricts and reduces the diversity that we're going to have. So it's no great surprise that when we actually introduce other functional groups into our mixes, that all of a sudden we've got different carbon cycling going on, we've got different organic matter types being put back into the soil. We've got, you know, low CDN ratio material, high CDN ratio material, that favours different organisms in the soil. We've got partitioning at depth. You know, we're not just farming the top 10 to 0 to 10 centimetres. Now, when was the last time a dairy farmer, I know you do, Kate, actually looked at the availability of nutrients and water below that ryegrass rooting depth? Okay, there's a really large amount of actually nutrition or nutrients and water at depth, and this is where the herbs are really playing a really strong part. They're actually utilising a resource that those shallow rooted species aren't doing. Okay, so I think what we're trying to do is actually migrate, change our pastures and move towards the benefits of nutrients. Now that's not mine either, that's Gorstian's review. But if we drill down a little bit deeper from that and look right down, this is some work done by Kangura and others out of Western Australia. It's more cropping based. I'm sure Lynn's probably aware of this work. And what it really just highlights is the importance of actually having a healthy soil biome. Symbiosis, competition, and microbial properties, increased turnover of nutrients, greater amount of nutrients is just in some ways satisfying that nitrogen requirement that we're not actually delivering in the bag as well. So look, and I'm glad to see that some of the stuff I've got here, John's already mentioned, so I'm going to skip through them really quickly, but some of that stuff that John presented there was out of his European Agro-Diversity project, and looking at a number of things, but there's a multitude of factors which actually determine the success of a multi-species sport, and we need to take these into account before we head on that journey. I'm sure, Kate, you actually looked at a number of these things with Jay before you decided what your species mixes were going to be. Okay, so soil type and fertility. Now, Karen G, in the conversation yesterday, talked about this all the time. There are certain soil types on one side of the farm, soil types on the other side of the farm, where different species are persisting and holding on. Okay? Species choice, the proportionality of functional groups, which Anna told us in her talk yesterday, is really, really quite important. Species richness doesn't guarantee species diversity. And look, there's another thing to us that in my abstract as well. Sanderson states that looking for species richness is not really a simple matter of actually sowing and selecting as many species as possible and sort of hoping for the best. There's enough information out there which actually allows us to make some educated choices, okay? Fertiliser rating and the likes. And for those people from New South Wales amongst us, there's a really, really good resource out there that we could go back to. That's Winnett's edition of the Farm Series handbooks on pastures in New South Wales. It actually takes the entire state of New South Wales, breaks it up into zones, breaks it up into rainfall within that zone, and then the soil type, high, medium type, and it actually gives you a list of species. Now, unfortunately, it's just grasses and legumes because we've got it out of herbs, and we've done everything we can to get rid of herbs in the past because most of our herbs are actually weeds. Okay? But there are some really, really good resources out there. So this is some of John's work, and I'll just quickly go through it. So what he's just demonstrating here is just a monoculture perennial ryegrass stand of 150 and 300 kilograms of nitrogen versus a 6-species mix at 150. And the figure on the right of the screen is actually the drought that he was referring to, not the drought by our standards, but the drought by Irish standards, but it does demonstrate that resilience. Okay, so there's lots of whys, okay, and whatever your reason is about why you want to do it, if it justifies that change, it allows you to actually begin that journey about looking at a more robust, diverse, productive pasture, then that's all well and good. But the where, so how do we actually support your decision? Now, we've seen the slide by John earlier, and again, it comes back to actually thinking about your soil as a resource, as much as, and it's not just everything in that top shallow part, and we want to actually exploit the depth. When I was doing work on subsoil constraints with the GRDC, we talked about the bucket. Okay, in the ryegrass world, we've got a very, very shallow bucket. It's 0 to 10. But we introduce these deeper rooted species and the likes, we've got a much deeper bucket. We've got a greater resource to draw on. We've got a greater resource to draw on than we're going to be water resilient. Okay? I can almost guarantee that the chicory that we saw chugging away at Simon's on the field trip, it's drawing on deep soil moisture. Okay? So, when you're thinking about your composition, each of the functional groups need to be represented. Specific growing conditions of those, so the shoulders of growth, and it's a case of, it doesn't matter whether it's ryegrass or cocksfoot or fescues, there's actually a continuum within each of those species. I'm just picking on the grasses here at the moment, which actually allow you to adapt to your particular soil type, okay? If you've got a heavy black soil, I think Karen G may have some of these, and you get good summer rainfall, then a continental fescue may suit you. heavier clay soil, a strawberry clover rather than, say, a white clover. Okay, and there's reasons for all of these. Coxwoods, you've got Mediterranean types, which are winter dominant in the rainfall. You've got intermediate types, which actually sort of give you a little bit of flex across winter and summer. And you've got your true continentals, which are geared towards summer rainfall and will take advantage of summer rainfall. We've had below average rainfall in West Gippsland, nothing compared to the lack of rainfall over here. But the only green feed I've got at the moment are my Coxwoods. Okay? Don't just disregard the species. Ryegrass is not bad, okay? Coxwood's not bad by itself, but look at their individual attributes and features and how it's actually going to contribute to your feed base. Consider climate, soil types, rainfall distribution, grazing management and requirements. Always have in mind to maximise yield, but don't forget about soil health, animal health as well. And there's also this whole issue of ecosystem services. I suppose the question that needs to be raised there, if we're going to be encouraging dairy farmers, or any farmer for that matter, to diversify their pastures and actually create these ecosystem services, how do we compensate them for it? Something for DA to think about. So, when you come to select these species, some of these you can use. You can use PTN data, FEI data. In time, the PTN will, I'm on PTN Technical Working Group as well, we will be increasing the number of species that we're evaluating. For example, I'm actually conducting white clover and chicory trials with the PTN now, so we'll start to see that data expand. MLA's involved now, so you see some of these more extensive species being included, hopefully Polaris and Coxwood in time as well. Don't disregard maturity in your species. And here, again, I'll focus on the grasses, but you've got an incredible range of fit when it comes to ryegrasses, okay? You've got Barbera at one end, I'm not going to pick on any particular varieties. You've got Vast and Align, Joke at the other end at plus 33. So you've got an incredible broad base of maturity times to actually reflect and match to your rainfall type. It's the same with the Coxwoods and the fescues, okay? And you can, and don't be scared to mix more than one species in two. You know, if you want to stretch a little bit, you could have an intermediate Coxwood mixed with a continental or vice versa. Don't forget about dormancy, particularly if you're playing around with lucerne and the likes, and Adam's going to tell us a little bit more about that later too. Plant habit, prostrate, erect, comes into it as well, and a whole other number of issues there that I've marked. Climate, incredibly important, so we need to think about temperature. Okay, different species, different functional groups will respond to different temperatures. Rainfall, we've already discussed, and then growing season length power, and what mix of species are going to give you that peak of growth, which matches your typical rainfall, and how you actually broaden those shoulders as well. What are you going to include in your mix? Soil profile and water holding capacity. I know Danny doesn't think too much about what we soil scientists do, but incredibly important. And sloping aspect and all those sorts of things that traditional agronomy is always considered, but we've probably disregarded in the past, or haven't given as much attention to in the past. Soil plant interactions. Obviously, pH is important. Okay, bedded species are suited to other to soils different pH. So it may be a case of subclovers versus say at the acidic end versus lucerne at the alkaline end. Okay. Fertiliser and liming requirements. Now, James Hill from TR actually made a really, really good point. They actually went out and worked out what the limiting factors were in the soil before they headed down that path. So they actually eliminated those soil constraints. And in some ways, we need to do the same thing if we want a successful multi-species pasture like this. Just putting a multi-species pasture into a tired, old, stale soil may not actually give you the results you want. So don't disregard the soil as an environment. Ensure that your pH is where it needs to be. It's not overly acidic. You've got a reasonable amount of nutrients to start. And that you've got enough legumes in your community as well to actually provide that nitrogen to get the system going. I think it's one of the biggest challenges to actually establishing multi-species pasture is that nitrogen economy, that transition period where you're going from a heavy nitrogen use on a ryegrass monoculture to your multi-species. Is there will be a time, there will be a cost where the soil microbial community's got to get back to the point where it's actually starting to cycle all those nutrients back through. And they need to be fed, they need carbon, okay? If you don't provide the right amount of carbon, that nitrogen cycle is not going to progress like you need it to. I'm not going to discuss too much of, oh, good God, talking too much. I'll quickly talk about the resource use gender profile, grazing requirements. Look, we're seeing that from a grazing perspective, if it's done right, there's no real differences. That's some work by Grace and the Lights, which actually said this, when it comes to grazing and how you do it, there are still some differences. And Anna showed the other day, yesterday, that there are some lower ME and crude proteins, but from the results we're seeing with regards to milk yield and milk composition, it may not actually be that important. Okay. Sowing new certified seeds, pastures with purpose, really quickly here. This was actually taken February last year, West Gippsland, all on the same day. Okay, the reason I put it in there is just to highlight that we all have different systems. You've got 20 tonnes of maize there on one side, you've got 20 tonnes of predominantly chicory and a few sunflowers, but they're done with different purposes. The maize crop's been deliberately grown for bulk feed. The one with the chicory is a beef block where they just are focusing on soil health. They don't care. And then the other two on the left-hand side, that's actually side-by-side paddocks on a dairy farm out of Durham. Ryegrass giving up the ghost, that's a 2-and-a-bit-year-old standard chicory that we've let run through. So have a clear purpose about what you want to achieve. There's plenty of these types of things around, but our mixed species pastures don't necessarily need to be perennial or annual. There's nothing wrong with the short-term focus in the middle. There's a transition, okay, to get to that final point in a persistent perennial stand. And as Danny showed us the other day, these usually the same culprits that are there. Make sure you've got representatives from each of the functional groups. Are really quite important. And that was just me quickly off the top of my head. There are plenty of grass options. There's actually a myriad of legumes that we don't use. And in the herbs and forbs, there's some of the ones that are around now. We included brassicas in that space, sunflowers and buckwheat are included in there as well. But what I want you to do, if you open head down this path, is actually push back on your trusted advisors, push back on your agronomists, and get them to actually justify why a particular species has been included in the mix. What's its function? What's its role? How is it going to make a contribution to your pasture base? And this is just a really quick one. This is an annual mix. Okay, you've got the grasses represented. There's a rationale there, energy, bulk feed, faster sufficient, and so on. There's a mixture of legumes, and then there's a range of different herbs in there as well. But I think the fit and the use pattern, but I think that as a minimum is the amount of information that your seed provider, or whomever it is, needs to give you to help you make a decision about what you include in your pastures. So look, we've talked about the benefits. I'm not going to reiterate these. John's already done that for us. But I will just focus on that last one for a moment. Environmentally positive, social licence is becoming increasingly important, and I can't remember the gentleman's name who spoke to us about having a story to actually help sell a product. Holden? John? Jack Holden, pardon me. Really, really important, okay, that story. And look, just a quick summary. So there are challenges. Make sure you get your design right, or as best as you can. Reinforce your successes, discuss your failures. Thank you.
Hope you can hear me all right. Thank you very much everyone for the opportunity to attend this conference and to present today, particularly because in my talk I'm going to narrow the focus right down to just one species. But please bear with me, because I think even though our research is really, I guess, centred upon one particular forage species, which is plantain, what we're learning about that plantain is really learning what the traits are of that feed that imparts the benefits in terms of animal production and environmental benefits. So what we can learn, we can then translate into what other species might possess the same traits, or what species mixtures might be able to have the same benefits. Right, so pastoral farming in New Zealand, where I'm from, traditionally it still is mainly based on rotational grazing of ryegrass clover pastures. And as we've already heard in this conference today, one of the key limitations of those pastures is reduced forage production and reduced herbage quality in that summer-autumn period. Additionally, a key limitation that's quite important in New Zealand is that these pastures often contain nitrogen levels, crude protein levels, that are in excess of what the animals need. So very high, they can be up to about 30% of the pasture dry matter. This surplus nitrogen can't be maintained by the animal, she must excrete it, and that becomes a source of environmental pollution. So 15 or so years ago, researchers started looking at what other pasture species are available that we could incorporate into our pastures to overcome these challenges. And a lot of this was driven by increasing legislation that was looking to reduce the environmental impact of dairying. So I was mostly going to focus on the environmental benefits of plantain, but I just will touch briefly on the work that we've done in terms of animal performance. So, of the slide, obviously. There's been a series of studies that have looked at the impact of including plantain in the diet of dairy cows, and generally, on the whole, including plantain in the diet either maintains milk production or improves milk production relative to ryegrass clover diets. And that comes down to forage quality and what you're comparing it to. So typically in that late lactation period, when ryegrass clover pastures are quite poor quality, the addition of plantain can help lift that production. We've also seen some limited impact on diets including plantain on milk quality. Occasionally when you include plantain in the diet at very, very high levels, we'll see a reduction in milk fat yield. But as mentioned by Anna yesterday, we have seen that there's an improvement in the nutritional value of milk by greater levels of omega-3, omega-6 fatty acids. We've also done some work looking at the impact of feeding plantain on the processability of milk, and there's no evidence to suggest that cows consuming diets with plantain has any impact on the ability of that milk to be turned into other products. So your croissants will be safe from being made with cows feed plantain. Okay, so on to focusing around the environmental benefits of plantain. So as I mentioned before, in New Zealand, mitigating the loss of nitrogen from pastoral systems is a key research initiative in the country, and this is associated with degradation of our freshwater bodies and government legislation looking to reduce it, which set in place targets so farmers can apply only up to 190 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare per year to their pastures in New Zealand. That excess nitrogen that's consumed by the cow is largely excreted in that urine patch, and that urine patch is a very, very high concentration of nitrogen, higher than what the plants can use, and that means that nitrogen entering the soil is subject to loss to the environment through leaching and through nitrous oxide emissions. Through the programs of work that we've been doing looking at plantain, lysimata studies have shown that when you include plantain in swards with ryegrass clover, we see a reduction in nitrogen leaching in the range of 30 up to 90% reductions in leaching compared to traditional pastures. Generally, the reductions are greater with greater inclusion of plantain in the sward, but there is variation associated with climate, time of year and soil type. More recently, the researchers have been looking at whether that can be scaled to a paddock, to a farm system scale. And so there's two trials they've been looking at from systems perspective, one in Canterbury of the South Island, that on average over 2 years, pastures that contained 15 to 30% plantain leached 17% less nitrogen than traditional pastures. Another study in Manawatu that Danny Donahue and his team were involved in also looked at increasing levels of plantain in the pastures and its impact on nitrogen leaching. Cows were grazing hydrologically isolated plots, so the plots were contained and all the leachate was collected. And what they found over a 4-year average is that sort of low and medium levels, so 20 to 30 levels of plantain in those pastures, impart a reduction in nitrogen leaching. However, what's been interesting to note that when the team has tried to achieve very, very high plantain contents in the pastures, they've actually overall seen an increase, well, a lesser reduction in their end leaching, and that is because it's very difficult to maintain that much plantain in the sward, and there's a big ingress of white clover and ryegrass, and that's basically adding more nitrogen into the system, which is diminishing that effect. So that sort of gives a bit of an indication about the system's impact of trying to achieve these reductions. Also been looking at nitrous oxide emissions. This is a study that was conducted by researchers at AgResearch, and what they found was that at the same level of urinary nitrogen applied across pastures with increasing levels of plantain in them, they saw a decrease in the amount of nitrous oxide emissions. So the more plantain in the pasture, the less nitrous oxide being produced. Then they also explored, well, what happens if you apply urine from animals that are also grazing pastures that have plantain on them, and they see an additive effect of that. So cows that are on diets including plantain, applying those urine patches to swards with plantain, we're seeing an additive effect on nitrous oxide emissions. It is important to note that it does vary quite widely with climate and soil type. So studies have shown that it can range between sort of 30 to 50% reductions in nitrous oxide emissions across the climate year in the same region, but also with soil type. So this is a graph showing nitrous oxide emissions with increasing proportion of plantain in the diet. In the blue bars, which is a well-drained soil, we did see that negative relationship with increasing plantain content resulted in decreasing nitrous oxide emissions, but on the less well-drained soil type, there was no difference. As you got more and more plantain, there was no advantage to mitigating nitrous oxide. So, through a lot of this work, we've been trying to understand what mechanisms are driving these benefits, and the first two mechanisms that have been identified are associated with the cow effect, the cow consuming that plantain. The first one is dilution, so that's dilution of urine nitrogen concentration through higher urine volumes from cows fed diets with plantain. The second is around how that dietary nitrogen is used and partitioned by the animal, how much she's using for making milk versus how much is being excreted. Mechanisms 3 and 4 are related to the soil, so these properties of plantain, whether it's being secondary compounds that are being exuded from the roots or leaf material that's inhibiting the nitrification process in the soil, so it's slowing down that processing of nitrogen in soil, or it's through those secondary metabolites being ingested by the animal and passed through into her urine, a bit like the ergot story we heard yesterday, and that those metabolites in that urine then in the soil acting to slow down that process of nitrification. The fifth process is about plantain's ability to reduce the amount of drainage that's coming through the soil profile. Plantain has a very extensive aggressive root system, and it can maintain and take up soil moisture. It's very water use efficient, but also soil moistures tend to be greater under pastures with plantain than without. So digging into those mechanisms just a little bit more, this is a meta-analysis conducted by a student at Exeter University. Through all the studies, we've collected way too much urine than I care to admit. We found that basically as you increase plantain content in a diet, we see a reduction, a positive reduction in urinary N concentration. And a lot of that is driven by this increase in urine volume. Plantain is very, very high in water content, so a lot of this increased urine volume is being driven by a large ingestion of water in her diet. and that's sort of expressed by more frequent urination events per day, which is positive from a leaching perspective because she's having more urination events spread out throughout the paddock. And there's other species that also have very high water content, so species like forage chicory, forage rape, therefore, they are likely to impart the same thing. And we do see reduced urine concentration from those species as well. Partitioning of dietary nitrogen. So plantain has specific sort of nutritive characteristics that change how dietary nitrogen is used. It's very, very high in soluble sugars. So this provides an energy source for the rumen microbes to effectively use that dietary nitrogen and turn it into product, whether that's milk or meat. Secondary to this, the forms of nitrogen are important in the plant. So plantain has a lower proportion of very highly soluble nitrogen, that soluble that's really rapidly degraded in the rumen and sent through the blood into the urine. And it has a higher concentration of rumen undegradable nitrogen. So that's nitrogen that will pass out into the intestine. It may be absorbed there, or it may be excreted in feces. And because these diets are still well supported for lactation in terms of their protein content, this greater degradation of protein has no impact on production. So what this net result is a reduction in nitrogen excreted in urine. Mechanisms 3 and 4 are around this biological nitrification inhibition process in the soil. We're working to understand what the metabolites are in the plantain and the root exudates that are generating this, and observe that there's variation between cultivars and their ability to achieve that, and breeders are looking at how they can exploit that. And the second one is around those metabolites that are passing through the animal and acting on urine to slow down the nitrification process. We've also been exploring enteric methane emissions. As the previous speakers just said, we don't want to be pollution swapping. Including plantain in the diet of dairy cows, its effect on methane emissions is really depending on what you're comparing it to. The studies that we've done have found that when you have plantain in the diets, early lactation in spring, very high quality forages, we don't necessarily see a methane reduction response. However, when we have those diets late lactation with sort of poorer quality autumn summer pastures, we have observed a 15% reduction in methane produced per unit of feed eaten and 24% improvement in methane per unit of milk produced. And we've been looking to see whether there's variation between cultivars, and to date there's no evidence to suggest that is the case, that there's variation. So, good timing. Right, to summarise, benefits of plantain. There's benefits that other species have talked about before, so potential to improve milk production and quality, evidence for reducing environmental impact. But it is important to note that, as other speakers have said, that challenges do remain on how we can maintain plantain in our swards. We tend to find that after 2 years we do have diminishing plantain content, so the program is looking to how we can sort of reintroduce plantain into our pastures to maintain good proportion. Thank you very much.
Okay, so just quickly before I start, just a big thank you to DA for giving me the opportunity to speak, and a big thank you to all of you for coming along and embracing the conversation, and it's really great to see such enthusiasm in the room. And a bit of a shout out again to Pete Sale. I think it sounds like everyone in the room got told by Pete, but he's been the catalyst for quite a few of us going onto this sort of regen journey, so thanks Pete. I'm lucky enough to work across southern Victoria as an independent advisor, mostly working around paddock scale projects around multi-species. So I'm asked to talk to you today just about the species and establishment strategies that I've seen on farm. So just a quick recap for the importance of functional diversity. This has been touched on by many speakers, but having those different functional groups is really crucially important. So make sure you're ticking off on your grasses, legumes, and non-leguminous forms. That does obviously include herbs, like chicory and plantain, but it also includes the odd bods, which I deal with a bit in the annual space in terms of brassicas, sunflowers, buckwheat, linseed, those types of plants. When I'm putting together a multi-species mix, again, narrowing down that focus to things that are really fit for purpose. So 6 to 12 species when you're starting off is just fine. It will give you enough functional diversity without becoming too complex or expensive. I do like to start off with annual multi-species first. That's primarily because they will help to prime the system before we move to perennials, when the system is really functioning well and those perennials can really establish and thrive. So the annual multi-species mixes, they can be used for several sowings or for several years, just to make sure that we're putting the system into place where our perennials will really persist well. Just a quick snapshot of some of the project results. So I do work across Southern Victoria, through the Western Districts and also into Gippsland with quite a few landcare networks predominantly funding these types of projects. The key take home, which a lot of people have also reiterated over the few days, is that the multi-species will really add value. They do give us an economic return while they're accruing all these soil health benefits and the ecosystem benefits, which is fantastic. So in a grazing system, if they're established successfully, they will add value to your system, which is great. Usually from these types of paddock scale trials, there's similar or better quality and similar or better production. And the benefit, particularly in a dryland system, is that we can have these complementary growth curves. So that means we can grow fit on the shoulders of the season and really take out some of those summer and early autumn feed gaps that plague us. And then that helps make our winter management much easier, and we can sort of start to optimise that grazing management to take care of our soil and our animals. We have an increase in ground cover, which is obviously very beneficial across the year. That means that we also have an increase in photosynthetic potential. So our plants, both sort of day on day, are photosynthesising more rapidly, usually, than our traditional pasture species, but they're also doing that for a longer period of the year. So in turn, that helps to support our soil biological population. And that feedback loop between the soil biology and the plants is crucially important to drive that system. There's good changes. I've seen all these changes on farms, so changes in soil structure, nutrient cycling, resilience to stress events, as others have touched on, so drought, pests, disease, etc. And sustained yields under a drop in FERT. So usually we can drop FERT out by 25% quite quickly, and that can go to a low or no FERT input, as we've seen and heard over the last few days. And we end up with quite a self-organising, profitable system that relies less on us and more on that plant-soil interface. I've just put together a slide for you for this, I guess, Southern Victorian region. Not every species you see on that slide has to be sown all at once, as I said before, so please pick the species that resonate with you that you think will be a good fit. But I've just split the slide into the 3 functional groups that we most often use, and again split it further into annuals and perennials. So these are just some of the species across Southern Victoria that I've seen work quite well across the region. So to the crux of the slide, I've been asked to talk about those more practical establishment techniques to really make sure that we're getting success out of sowing these multi-species pastures. So the establishment phase is absolutely critical. If you're going to take home something from this talk, please photograph this slide if you're going to photograph one of them, because it is crucially important to get that multi-species up and going. And there is a little bit of an ethos in regen ag, and there's no harm in it, but it is to do no harm to the soil, and that can bite us in the bum a little bit in terms of getting these multi-species up and going. So we need to be quite practical in our approach, particularly in those transition years when we're moving from a high input perennial ryegrass system usually to a multi-species system. That perennial ryegrass is well established, competitive, heavily fertilised, and we need to create space and opportunity for those multi-species seeds to get up and get going. So usually strategically putting a bit of chemical or cultivation into the system and disturbing that system, as Damien and Lynn have said, does create us that opportunity to get those seeds up and going. The goal, though, should be that we can change that intervention level over time. So starting off aggressively and practically, making that change, and then weaning off that intervention level as the system responds to that and we start to get on top of some of that base pasture competition. some factors that might sway you towards either chemical or cultivation. So if your soils are light, sandy soils, they're a little bit fragile, they might be prone to erosion, they might be on a slope, that's where chemical control might work better for you to avoid disturbing that soil structure. If you've got heavier soil types, that disturbance, that cultivation, might actually be quite advantageous. So it can help you to form a seedbed if your paddocks are rough or pubbed in some way. It can alleviate some of those shallow or even deeper compaction layers that we might have, those hard pans that stop root penetration. It can open up soils, so start to help alleviate some of those anaerobic conditions, particularly in a winter-dominant rainfall environment, which we do have. And if we need to incorporate some inputs like lime and gypsum that are better worked in, those can all be potential factors that might lead you to choose either chemical or cultivation. So I'm going to focus for the show and tell next couple of slides on some of the local results from projects around establishment. But these are, bearing in mind, these are results that have a very common theme across southern Victoria. So I've seen this time and time again in paddocks. So the HB District Land Care Network has been really instrumental in this part of the world in getting regen projects funded and on the ground. And they've run some climate resilient projects too from 2020 to 2023. So there were at least 40 farms involved, and we were doing sort of hectare plots with different treatments across the farms. The majority of those farmers chose multi-species as their adoption strategy of choice, and usually saw a doubling of that summer and early autumn fodder, which made their feed wedge management across the year much more effective. So there was immediately a good positive return on that, but also we assessed machinery, which is what I want to show you now. So this is just a slide. Yep, good, you can all see that. This is just a slide from this summer of 2020, 2021. And for those of you that are local, you may remember that that was quite a nice season. For those of you that aren't local, we had a really soft finish. So our perennial ryegrass pastures and our other perennial grass pastures did persist into the summer. They were still competitive and green, as you can see in that photo that's taken in February. So we did have base pasture competition. So when we put our 4 different machines across our region over that 30 farms in this particular summer, we had really, really different establishment results from those machines. So we chose 4 machines in varying levels of cultivation aggressiveness, and we wanted to test their efficacy. So the disc drill going straight into a pasture, particularly on medium to heavy soils, failed. Just across the bat. It really wasn't an option for us. There's no return on investment from that multi-species sowing. The soil key renovator, which is a Gippsland machine, I do believe it has a place, but particularly on these medium to heavy soils with base pasture competition, it really did struggle to establish for us. So we sowed 13 plots on 13 farms in this particular summer period, and it failed on 11 of those 13 farms. So the only 2 farms where it established really well, the multi-species mix was on light soil types with more open pasture bases. So the soil key, although I do believe it has a niche in our systems, it is perhaps a machine to transition to in most cases rather than one to start with. In comparison, our rotor strip till, it's another strip till machine, obviously, so similar in concept to the soil key, but the design is a bit different. It is more aggressive in its cultivation within that sowing row, and they're a bit wider too. So I'd say it cultivates about 50% of the pasture, and no worries, it built into paddocks and got our multi-species up and going really well. The only reason why it doesn't have a little bit more fodder on that plot that you can see in the photo is that it was sown a month after the other 3 plots in that paddock. So establishing quite well, and then our tried and trusty power harrow, quite ubiquitous to this region, doing a good job getting into those heavy soils. So from the results of those trials, myself and colleague Tony Evans is in the audience, we put together some data from those projects, and we decided to come up with a bit of a guide. If you're assuming cultivation is going to be your weapon of choice in terms of establishing these multi-species pastures, we wanted to kind of take a little bit of the guesswork out of which machine you might use. So it's just really helping, hopefully, to improve the success in those transition years of sowing multi-species pasture. So it's quite a simple guide. It's freely available on the Heytesbury District Landcare Network website as a downloadable PDF. And it really just takes you through 4 key factors that we thought were quite crucial to the success of sowing. So they're just time of sowing, what you've done in the paddock previously in terms of preparation, the previous pastoral crop, and your soil type. Those rating values that you can see on the screen are fixed. Tony and I spent quite a bit of time getting them hopefully right. If you run your strategy through and it doesn't come out right, please let us know. But to our knowledge, we've ground truthed it quite extensively. So those ratings are fixed. You pick the factor or the scenario that best suits you out of those 4 categories, and you add up the score, and it gives you a recommendation on minimum, medium or heavy cultivation. So it's a very quick guide. You may only use it a couple of times and then you'll sort of understand it. You probably won't ever use it again. But it is a guide to hopefully take some of the guesswork out of establishment with machinery. If you're on the flip side and you have some of those lighter soils or the chemical approach appeals to you a little bit more, that's fine. They're all tools in the toolbox that you can use in these transition years, and they are all effective. So this is just a bit of a snapshot. I've also obviously seen this a lot across southern Victoria, is that if we are direct drilling into paddocks, even if we've hard grazed first before, which this particular paddock wasn't, but I've seen a lot of hard grazing in direct drilling, usually in most cases it doesn't work either. So this is just a snapshot. I asked the farmer to just leave me a little strip in the paddock. This is just in Colac a couple of summers ago, and he left a little strip where he didn't apply Roundup before sowing. So the same mix is direct drilled right across that paddock, and the only difference between the 2 sides, or the strip of failure, is the fact that there's no Roundup on that strip first. So we do need to be practical in these transition years to get on top of that base pasture competition. So this particular farmer has weaned off those herbicide applications now. He controlled his pasture base a couple of times, and now he's just direct drilling. So again, it's an example of being practical at the start and being able to wean off those inputs over time. In terms of the transition to perennials, once you've primed the system with annual multi-species, some of the factors that you could use to transition to a more perennial base is production. So the dry matter of your paddock, if you've benchmarked at the start, then you will be able to assess whether you're improving on that pasture production over time. If you visually assess your soil and your pasture, and again, if you've created a baseline of that soil health and pasture health, you can use that to assess whether you're going in the right direction. You can back that up with soil and plant testing as well. If you sustain yield, dry matter production, with a reduction in inputs, that's a really good sign that the soil biology and that plant interaction is taking up the strain, if you are able to drop out particularly some of those synthetic ferts. So it's a good sign that perennials are going to start to thrive in that system. And if you have germination of desirable species, particularly if you haven't sown them. So if something pops up in the sward and you like it, you like the fact that it's there, it's a sign that you've changed that soil paradigm and that you might be able to put perennials into that system. That transition could take 1 to 4 years, so you do need to be a little bit patient in this phase, and that very much depends on your baseline and where you started from. So it's obviously heavier soils and more degraded soils will take more time. Potentially lighter soils, more organic matter and more fertility will take less time for you to transition to perennials. But I would start usually with annuals first to make sure that you are successfully transitioning across to a perennials state. There is a little bit of a caveat, and people have alluded to it before, is that those static perennial mixes, I don't believe over time, over a longer period of time, that they optimise the diversity of the mix or the productivity and profitability of the mix. So I think there's an opportunity over time to top up those perennial mixes and create a bit of a mosaic of different multi-species mixes and probably even some traditional pasture types on the farm, so that you are optimising your diversity in terms of annuals, perennials of different mixes and different pasture types across the farm. And that is probably where those strip drill machines and disc drills come into their own once you establish those perennial mixes to be able to get them on farm. Last slide. So the take-homes. Establishment is really crucial. Our multi-species can really complement our traditional pastures, especially if it's stabilising that fodder production curve, and they can do this in an economically viable way while we're also accruing all those soil health and ecosystem benefits. So I think as a low-hanging fruit option in a grazing system, I think this multi-species pastures is really a good way to go. It should be a dynamic system for best benefit, so we should be tweaking it over time to make sure that we get the most out of them, to improve our level of profitability, sustainability and biodiversity on farm. So thank you very much.
Hello, ladies and gents. You know the drill. I think John's waiting patiently online, waiting to see what happens next with pigeon milk. But you know the drill. So, over to Donna from Gardner.
Thank you, Greg. What a session. 5 thought-provoking presentations focusing on practical considerations for implementing multi-species pastures on farm. Let's just jump straight into questions. Anybody got one? Peter down the front. Microphone's coming.
Peter Neves from Newry. Just for Jade, you said about how annuals prime the system. Just wondering what you meant by prime and how they do it.
Thanks, Pete. So I guess priming to me is about activating soil biology, improving nutrient cycling, getting roots to depth, creating a system where we have less weeds and disease pressure. So all of those things, taking out some of those constraints in terms of priming the system. It also enables us to get a handle on weeds and other issues that we might have in that annual phase without committing to something like expensive perennial seed and then having a bit of a failure. So things like that. So priming the system is, I suppose, a broad term, but it just, I guess, boils down to minimising the constraints that our perennials might face by dealing with them in an annual phase.
Thanks, Jade. Question up the back.
Rodrigo from there, Australia. Thanks everyone for your presentations, very insightful. I think Adam touched on an important challenge there for those perennial temperate species such as cocksfoot and ryegrass, and that is hot weather affecting their perenniality, and we also know that it can affect the quality as well. So in southeastern Australia and other parts of the country, in the upcoming decades, we're expecting to see warmer conditions and more of those hot weather events. So if you were to look into your crystal balls and predict what future pasture species or mixtures we're going to implement, what do you foresee that's going to look like in parts of southeastern Australia? Is it going to be more annuals? Are we going to see more perennial subtropicals? What do you think?
Great question. I think for starters that there'll be a lot of reliance on deeper rooted species, and that will help our drought resilience. Probably some more tropical species, but I might swap over to Damien.
Thanks, Jade. Well, firstly, there's a range of summer active C4 grasses to consider. I think the DA's got the tropical milk program, we're probably looking at some of that. So, C4 milk, pardon me, really. So, roach grass, brachiaria, all those types of things may actually creep further down the coast. Let's not forget what I alluded to earlier, that within those species that we're currently using, fescues, cocksfoots and ryegrasses, these are continual. There are different maturity groups in that, which you've got chop and change and mix. Let's not forget the differences in diploids and tetraploids too in some of those species. So I think we'll just have to adjust. There's always been this sort of reliance in dairy of later and later maturing ryegrasses, but it may be that we need to sort of shift that growth curve back to sort of better match the rainfall that we get with a changing environment.
Yeah, look, in our system we are still umming and ahhing which way to go, and like I said, we're looking at those fescues, but even looking at even at loose and chicory mixes are more biannual sort of program, like I said, to suit our system. But yeah, look, it's certainly a worry of our system, just trying to get that perenniality. But we've been able to have a punt on it because we haven't had the reliance on perennial ryegrass underneath it. So I guess we've been more willing to have a throw at the stumps. So.
Got a question up the back there, and then we've got Kate down too.
Probably to Damien and John, and this may be my visibility, but we have a generation or 3 generations of ryegrass breeding that we're probably fairly well aware of. We don't appear to have that history or that depth in other alternate species breeding. So how do you see the evaluation of that, firstly, and secondly, are we putting enough emphasis or worldwide on making sure that we have those species as good as possible for what we want them to do?
I'll either go first and I'll give John a go. Yes, there's been obviously a much more considerable focus on ryegrass breeding. Unfortunately, in my position, I actually get to look at a range of genetic resources from around the world. We're currently evaluating copsewood out of France, from Mediterranean France. So there are breeding programs around. It's just a matter of tapping into those and actually finding fescues as well. The state's pretty strong in that. So they are there, but if they're going to become more important inclusions in the grass proportion of our mixtures, then yes, there needs to be a concurrent emphasis on the breeding too. So softleaf copsewoods and fescues, better feed quality and the like. So it is happening, but not to the same extent that it is in ryegrasses.
Can I hop in there as well, if you can hear me?
Yes, please, John.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, great question. And we do know from some of our work here, where we look at gradients of perennial ryegrass genotypes as we go from Northern Europe to Southern Europe. I mean, there are very prominent changes that help cope with the change in weather conditions as we go through this climatic gradient. At the same time, the match of the species and the climatic conditions is always tough to get, and of course it's difficult to predict what the future conditions will be because they haven't happened yet. At some point it may be worth investing that energy and effort in the breeding programs instead of trying harder and harder to find genotypes of perennial ryegrass. I think there needs to be a decision about at what point does it become more profitable to look at other species to look for that adaptation potential. A related point, I think you mentioned the other alternative forages. I think the breeding programs are well behind, and there does seem to be a lot of genetic variability that has not been well selected for things like chicory, even plantain, and other alternatives that are out there. So there's definitely a breeding program there. And finally, you mentioned the point about as good as possible. I've seen trials by colleagues who are looking at seed availability on the market and comparing different providers. I won't name names here, it doesn't matter to any of you, but I won't name them here either. Sorry, this is on the continent of Europe, and there is enormous variation in seed quality, and this directly translates, as you would expect, into enormous variation in the performance of mixtures and their susceptibility to weed invasion, yield drops, and so on. And for example, Swiss colleagues have a very sophisticated but very effective system of ensuring seed quality in mixtures through a levy on the industry. But the returns are really credible. It's voluntary for farmers to buy this quality assured seed, but they choose to do so because they know that it's an investment at a very critical point in the establishment. Thank you.
Thanks, John. We'll go to Kate down the front here, and then we'll go up the back. Rebecca there. Thank you.
Thank you. Am I on? Yeah. Joyous session, really so much rich information. On the breeding program side, if we're talking about expanding the breeding program, from my point of view, I'd like to know whether we're also expanding from just what's the forage quality and quantity and heading or seeding time. Are we also exploring things like which cultivar has the best ability to prime the soil, which cultivar has the best ability to host phosphorus solubilising organisms, which cultivar has the best ability to host free-living nitrogen fixing organisms, which one punches through a hard pan.
In short, great things to have and great attributes to have in any of the species in your mix, but I'm going to say no, or nothing that I'm aware of.
Could that be brought into future breeding programs?
I'm not a geneticist by any stretch, and it's probably a question for Kev, but we would have to identify the markers that are responsible for those particular attributes and how many genes are responsible for transferring that attribute. Could it be done? Yes, probably at considerable or great cost. And I suppose in the moment there are other sort of low-hanging fruit with regards to feed quality, lignin content and persistence and the likes that we're probably more focused on at the moment than those particular attributes. I could be wrong, I'm happy to be corrected, but I think they're sort of admirable attributes to have, but there's a lot of work that would need to go into actually identifying the genes responsible for those traits.
We'll go up the back now there.
Rakesh Awale from AgTech. I've got two questions actually. The first one to Jay. My question is, do you know of anyone who's been trying deep reaping in multi-species or pasture and pasture areas? The second question to anyone on the board regarding when is a good time of rotation, grazing rotation for mixed pasture species?
Okay, thank you. Yes, I do know of deep ripping pre-multi-species. Deep ripping has obviously been used for a long time, but I suppose the incorporation of multi-species, especially with our deeper taproots and deeper rooted species, probably really assists the deep ripping. So there is a group in Gippsland, Jen Smith spoke yesterday. A lot of the members there going into new country, they will deep rip, and then they'll put in, a really heavy proportion of those taprooted and deep-rooted species to really maximise the effect of that deep ripping. So it's probably something that you've seen as well, Damien.
Yeah, look, I'd just like to add a comment on there. Many years ago I was involved with GRDC subsoil constraints, and while we demonstrated that deep ripping would actually alleviate those compaction issues and issues with bulk density, like without actually including some sort of organic amendment down the slot, or be it via a plant growing into that space, then you may as well not bother deep ripping. So by all means deep rip, drag cold hard steel through the ground, but make sure you actually put something into that slot to actually change the environment and allow the appropriate porosity to develop.
Thanks, Damien. Sorry, and your second? Oh yes, grazing. Grazing, the $1 million question. Well, we can all probably comment on that, but farmers that I work with, they do, for best benefit, extend the grazing rotation across a lot of the year. Sometimes they will tighten up for quality considerations, particularly in terms of dairy cows getting that milk into the vat in an uninterrupted and uncrashing kind of way. But usually it is extending out that grazing rotation to 60, 90 days. Beef and sheep can be longer than that. And it does just really depend on the ratio of the mix in terms of the broadleaf and legume components. So those mixes will keep quality for quite a considerable amount of time on those long rotations, but it's just really managing that on your own farm with your own mixes to make sure that you are getting that balance. But it is obviously very good for the soil in terms of taking that up out that rotation. It's good for pasture persistence, it's good for livestock in most instances as well. So there's a lot of benefits from being able to extend that rotation.
Kath, you get to ask your question really quickly.
I've given it the thumbs down, Donna. But thank you. Eleanor, I was really interested in the plantain work that Music Dairy NZ have done, but have they done any of the nitrous oxide emissions and the nitrate leaching in in combination. So you sort of had results of nitrous oxide, and is that being done in combination? And are there any changes to what you see when you just looked at it?
I am aware there's been done by AgriSearch and Manaki Whenua, where they have lysimeters and they measure leaching and nitrous oxide emissions at the same time, but I'm not across those results at this stage. Thanks.
Great, thank you guys. That's going to wrap up our question time now. If you didn't get to ask a question, make sure you catch the speakers during the break. And we really want to thank John Finn for hanging on online there, considering it's very late over there. Please thank our panel